What's up, my fellow light lover? Today's review covers the Aputure 600C Pro Mark II. This update to the original 600C Pro boasts increased brightness, better low-level dimming, and an IP54 rating. These upgrades sound enticing, but are they worth the cost if you have an original 600C that's still working? How about, is this light worth purchasing if you're like me and are looking for your first high wattage RGB light? The Aputure 600C Pro Mark II is a 720 watt point source RGB WW light. The fixture comes with a ballast, head unit, power cable, extended header cable, and a newly updated reflector dish. Since much of this light is similar to the original release, both in form and in function, I only want to touch upon a couple of my favorite features before we dive into testing the claimed upgrades. Like the rest of Aputure's Pro lineup, the intensity level in all modes can be adjusted in 0.1% increments. Second, the CCT mode has a wide color temperature range, going from 2300 Kelvin at the low end to 10,000 Kelvin at the upper, while including green magenta adjustment. And the HSI mode includes my favorite feature, one that I hope becomes standard as the industry moves forward. This light allows us users to set the color temperature of the white point when the light is at 0% saturation. The setting can be useful for adding colors to our scenes when the color temperature of the camera has been shifted to something other than 5600 Kelvin, like if we're trying to match to the color temperature of on-location lighting while still maintaining proper brand colors on a commercial gig. Aputure is claiming 3 upgrades on the 600C Pro Mark II when compared to the original 600C. 1, an IP54 rating, 2, better low-level dimming, and 3, increased brightness. First, Aputure was able to secure an IP54 rating for the new unit, meaning that it's dust protected and water splashing against the enclosure in any direction won't affect operation. I'm pretty happy with this upgrade, which brings the weatherproofing of the 600C Mark II in line with the rest of their Pro fixtures. One of the main issues with the 600D and 600X, and one that the 600C Mark I also sort of suffers from, is the inability to get really dim when the intensity is set to 0.1%. What this meant from a gaffer standpoint is that I always needed to have a few smaller lights on hand in case the 600s were too powerful to balance to existing lighting on location. But now, the low-level dimming of the 600C Mark II really opens up possibilities for where a 600 watt light can be used in on-location work. Also, the DMXQ from 0 to 2% over 5 seconds is much smoother on this light than the 600D or the 600C Mark I, as well as the initial spark from 0 to 0.1%, which is what they were probably really trying to sell us on. As for the increased brightness, well, that question brings us to the most important section of any light review, so let's talk about the light quality of the Aputure 600C Mark II. I tested the original 600C Pro, the 600D Pro, and the new 600C Pro Mark II in maximum output mode using the F10 Fresnel in either spot or flood mode as indicated over the course of the next section. The overall conclusion is that the 600C Mark II does indeed increase the brightness while maintaining a similar quality of light as the original 600C, but that doesn't mean there isn't room for improvement. First, I measured the output at intensity levels from 100% to 5% in 5% increments at both 5600 and 3200 Kelvin with the F10 Fresnel in flood mode from 10 feet away. Here's what the resulting graph looks like for the 600C Mark II, along with the actual measured values that I obtained here on the left. The most important takeaway from this first graph is that the 600C Mark II doubles output when the intensity value is doubled anywhere along the intensity range. I love this result because when the DP asks for a light to be reduced by a stop, I know that I can just cut the intensity in half. For reference, Here's how these results compared to the original 600C with the F10 Fresnel in flood mode. As you can see, the 600C Mark II is one stop brighter than the Mark I. At 7,000-ish lux max output at 5600 Kelvin, the new 600C Mark II is also about 2/3 of a stop dimmer than the 600D, which topped out at 11,300 lux in this same test. When the Fresnel switched to spot mode, the measured lux values for the 600C Mark II more than doubled at peak intensity at 5600 Kelvin, going from 7,000 lux to 15,000 lux, while still maintaining the same output to intensity ratio as described earlier. And as for how the 600C Mark II compares to the other two lights, here's how that data looks. A very similar ratio between these three lights as in flood mode. The 600C Mark II comes in about one stop brighter than the original 600C and about 2/3 of a stop dimmer than the 600D. To see how the low-end dimming performs, I tested the output at each intensity level from 2% down to 0.1% in 0.1% increments. The 600C Mark II dims to just 21 lux at 0.1 intensity at a distance of 10 feet with the F10 Fresnel in spot mode. And it does this while consistently doubling the measured output every time the intensity is doubled. The quality of the light also continues to meter within 100 Kelvin of 5600 Kelvin along this lower intensity spectrum, although the magenta shift does increase slightly to just below a quarter magenta correction as intensity lowers to 0.1%. When compared to the other two, we can clearly see the difference in the low-level performance between the Mark II and the original 600C, and how vastly better the low-level performance of the 600C Mark II is compared to the 600D. If you stared at the prior intensity graphs way too much like me, you'll remember that the 600D was around 3,000 lux at 5%, so to only further reduce by 2/3 of a stop down to 1850 at 0.1% intensity shows a pretty poor relationship between intensity and lux at the low end, especially when compared to the performance of the new 600C Mark II, which is able to reduce its output all the way down to 21 lux. And that's with the F10 Fresnel in spot mode, so that figure could be even lower. Another thing I like to know is how consistently a light stays at either 5600 Kelvin or 3200 Kelvin as intensity is reduced from 100% to 5% in 5% increments. Ideally, a light measures exactly at 5600 Kelvin or 3200 Kelvin with no green magenta shift, labeled as delta UV or DUV on these graphs. The 600C Pro Mark II tested pretty well in this regard at both 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin. The delta UV was approximately -0.002 for both graphs, indicating a magenta color shift equal to approximately 1/8 of a color correction gel. And we can see here that both of these graphs are relatively similar to the 600C Mark I, although I do wish that the 3200 Kelvin readings on the new 600C Mark II were as tight as the original 600C. I was curious why both the original 600C and the 600C Mark II had this noticeable magenta hue shift to them at both 5600 Kelvin and 3200 Kelvin, when I know that Aputure has the technical capability to minimize this. And I found my answer when I did this same test with the 600D. It appears to me like Aputure has tuned their whole product lineup to be similar in output to their older daylight fixtures. This way, everything blends well when working together, even if it does mean sacrificing a small amount of color accuracy on the newer RGB fixtures. And if you're curious to learn more about this graph, like why the y-axis is labeled using this weird spacing like I did, or how I created any of the upcoming graphs, feel free to click the link in the description to watch my color science primer video. This next graph shows how well the Aputure 600C Mark II tracks the TM30 reference white values as color temperature is adjusted from 2700 Kelvin to 7000 Kelvin in 100 Kelvin increments. Put another way, This graph shows how well the light tracks the idealized color temperature and green-magenta adjustment curve. This standardized color temperature line is labeled as the TM30 reference line here on this graph. This graph really highlights to me how Aputure's dedication to color correcting their newer RGB lights to work with their older lights to maintain an ecosystem can also be viewed as a detriment. The 600C Mark II is about an eighth magenta color correction gel for much of the color temperature range, and nearly at 1/4 color correction value starting at 6,000 Kelvin. There's also this really weird jump in the magenta value at 5,900 Kelvin, where the light visibly goes from about an eighth to a nearly quarter magenta color correction value. I tested this oddity multiple times to verify it, so it isn't just some experimental fluke. This shift also appears as the intensity is adjusted from 100 to 75 to 50 and 25%, becoming less noticeable as the intensity is reduced. For reference, here's how those same measurements look on the original 600C. We can see how this light has a similar magenta shift, meaning these lights will probably do a great job blending together. And one framing of this is that this is a great move, since the original 600C and the newer 600C Mark II are technically the same model. But as a result of this magenta shift, both of these 600Cs may not blend perfectly with more color accurate lights without some additional tuning by the operator. But enough about color temperature, these are RGB lights. So how well does the 600C Mark II perform in RGB mode? This first graph represents how much of the color gamut is covered by the 600C Mark II in RGB mode as viewed in a CIE 1976 color space, which was chosen because it's a perceptually uniform color space. XY coordinates were obtained using a Sekonic C800, which were then translated to UV coordinates using the standard transformation formula. Measurements were taken in 30-degree hue increments from 0 to 360 degrees, and as saturation was decreased from 100 to 75 to 50%. I also took readings across intensity levels of 100%, 75, 50, and 25% to make sure the 600C Mark II's color reproduction stayed consistent across intensity levels. This and the following RGB tests were done at a distance of 10 feet with the F10 Fresnel in flood mode. While there isn't a perfect standard for manufacturers to hit on this graph, I'd have still liked to see Aputure cover the gamut more evenly, particularly between 100 and 75% saturation, as these values barely perceptibly change for some of the hues. Like red, for instance, we can see how close these points are on the graph, and here's what that same saturation change of 100% to 75% looks like to my camera. Barely noticeable. And 50% saturation still leaves a lot of ground to cover to get to the 0% saturation white point that's located here on the graph. However, this graph does stay relatively consistent as intensity is reduced from 100% to 75 to 50 and then 25%. Compared to the original 600C at 100%, we can see that a lack of even distribution amongst gamut coverage was something that the original 600C suffered from as well, and at each intensity level. One thing I do want to note is that it seems Aputure has gotten new LED emitters for their blue and green LEDs between models. The original 600C had a blue emitter around 465 nanometers, while the new 600C Mark II seems to have one around 455 nanometers. 465 nanometers targets the actual wavelength of blue as our eyes see it. This new bluish diode at 450-ish nanometers is closer to a pure blue LED diode wavelength. Also, the green LED follows that same trend and has moved from around 540-ish nanometers at visual green to something like 530-ish nanometers, shifting the true green wavelength to a more pure green LED diode output as well. I'm not really sure what to make of this. There's a variety of reasons, from supply chain issues to how condensed the LEDs are on the cob, that could have caused this switch. Another way to look at this data is to ask the following two questions. How consistently does the 600C Mark II stay at the selected hue value as intensity is adjusted from 100 to 75 to 20 to 25%? And does this consistency change as saturation is adjusted from 100 to 75 to 50%? When viewed this way, the 600C Mark II stays relatively consistent across intensity levels at 100% saturation. At 75 and 50% saturation, we begin to see a visible shift in the output of the purple and pink hues as the intensity is reduced. This 50% saturation graph also highlights to me, again, how much of the color gamut is left to cover with what's left of the adjustment knob. And for reference, here's how the original 600C performed at each intensity level. Lastly, I tested the light in HSI mode from 0 to 360 degrees in 5-degree increments. This was done at 100% intensity and 100% saturation. And this graph gives us an indication of how well a light performs at covering the entire hue wheel. Like the prior RGB graphs, there really isn't an ideal graph for a manufacturer to hit here. However, these tight groupings in the corners at red, green, and blue means a loss of fidelity in other areas. And we can see this represented as these longer spacings in the hue values here, here, and here. These groupings in the corners also means that when we're near hue values of 0, 120, and 240 degrees, the light won't perceptibly change to us until we're nearly 10 degrees away, like in the case of red and blue, or almost 20 degrees away, like with green. I would have hoped that this would be more evenly spread, as the values between 0, 120, and 240 should just theoretically be calculated averages or something. But even when viewed in the more commonly used CIE 1931 color space, we can see there isn't any standardized distance to the spacing of these points. A lack of consistency in the spread of the measured hue values is another area that Aputure struggled with in the previous model, as we can see when we compare the two. As for the quality of the spectral output, at 5600 Kelvin, the 600C Mark II had an SSI score of 73 and a TM30 RF score of 93. And at 3200 Kelvin, the SSI score was 85 with a TM30 RF score of 96. These readings were taken at a distance of 3 feet with the bare cob. These results, while not outstanding, do put the 600C Pro Mark II right in line with most other fixtures in 2024. All right, I'm just gonna rapid fire some final observations at you about the 600C Mark II before we talk about whether or not I think it's worth the $2,500 price tag. First, I'd like to see Aputure change how their head unit is designed for upcoming launches. It would be great if us end users could replace the brake mechanism ourselves after it's worn out with time. This isn't a complaint that's particular to the 600C Mark II, but I just wanted to throw it into the void, and hopefully it gets heard and put on somebody's to-do list. Two menu options are different on the new 600C Mark II. There's no frequency selection, and there's the addition of a DMX status screen. The exclusion of the former is because Aputure has implemented flicker-free operation and rolled it into their HyperSync technology branding, and the inclusion of the DMX screen showing address, mode, signal strength, and battery life is much appreciated for those of us who run our lights with CRMX controllers. Speaking of DMX, There's a DMX smoothing option that's included in the 600C Mark II, which I love to see. One thing that does bug me with the DMX connection though, is that unlike the original 600C, once the light is connected to a CRMX controller, it can no longer be manually operated from the ballast. Even if I don't have my iPad open and sending a DMX signal, it still won't let me switch over. And lastly, and very weirdly, the case got bigger. The light's the same size, the body housing's the same size, the ballast is the same size, so why did the case get bigger? After hearing everything that I've had to say, should you buy this light? Honestly, while I did buy a second one, this light kind of feels like a version 1.5 in some ways to me. The increased intensity is truly the reason that I'm buying it, and the decreased output at 2% and below is, like, nice to have. But these features also feel to me like ideas that Aputure was testing for newer lights by using the 600 head size as a prototype reference. Then when they realized that they could just package these new features into a 600C, they turned on their manufacturing process, ran a few tests, and here we are. And while the light does match perfectly with the rest of their ecosystem, I would prefer it if the CCT mode on a fully green magenta adjustable light was tuned to meter closer to the TM30 reference point, since that's the actual standard. And this is definitely something that I wish that they had fixed between releases. Now, don't get me wrong, I like this light. And again, enough to purchase another one for my own kit. But I completely understand why some more recent purchasers of the original light feel like this release was a gut punch, especially without any buyback program in place. So, if you've already got the original and you're still getting rentals and the output at both the high and low ends hasn't really been an issue for you, then I don't really see a reason to upgrade to the Mark II. The color science between the two models is the same, so there aren't any gains to be had there. However, if you're like me and you were unimpressed with the output of the original 600C, so you waited to buy it, crossing your fingers and hoping for an eventual 600C release that would be closer to the intensity of a 600D, then I'm sure that this is the light you were waiting for. Incremental improvements between models aside, when viewed solely as its own release and not a second generation, this light performs really well and is built to the same quality as the rest of the Aputure Pro lineup. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.